Picture this. It's the year 1287, deep in the heart of northern China. The night is pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and steals hope. An old fortress stands against the horizon, its ancient walls built centuries before by hands long turned to dust. Inside, soldiers wait, not soldiers of some mighty empire, but rebels, desperate men who believe they're about to win. They've barricaded the gates, they've stocked their weapons, they've prepared for a siege that they think will last for months, maybe even years. They have no idea that the next few hours will rewrite the entire history of warfare, and none of them will survive to tell the tale. But wait, let me take you back further, because understanding how we got here is the real story. Before the thunder, the world that didn't know what was coming. To understand the significance of that night in 1287, you need to understand the world that existed before it. For thousands of years, warfare was intimate, personal, brutal. When soldiers fought, they looked their enemies in the eye, they heard their screams, they felt the resistance of a body as their spear pierced flesh, a warrior's skill, his strength, his courage. These were the things that determined who lived and who died. Armies conquered cities by battering wooden gates with logs. They scaled walls with ladders and ropes. Skilled archers could kill men from 100 yards away, but shooting an arrow required years of training. Your fingers would bleed, your shoulders would ache. You became one with the bow, and the bow became part of you. Kings feared archers more than any other weapon, because they represented the future range combat that didn't require you to be directly above or next to your enemy. But in China, something extraordinary was happening in the shadows of history. Around the 10th century, Chinese alchemists weren't trying to find weapons. They were searching for immortality. They mixed saltpeter, sulfur and charcoal together, looking for some magical elixir that would let emperors live forever. Instead, they created something that would kill millions upon millions. They created gunpowder. For centuries, the Chinese used this discovery in ways that might seem silly to us now. They made fireworks, beautiful, colourful explosions to light up the night sky during celebrations. They used gunpowder to launch flaming arrows, what they called fire lances, at their enemies. These weapons were impressive, terrifying even, but they weren't game changers. They were novelties, impressive fireworks attached to war. But innovation is a process. It's not a lightning bolt, it's a slow burn. And by the 13th century, Chinese engineers were asking a dangerous question. What if we put the gunpowder inside a metal tube? The birth of thunder. The earliest cannons were crude, terrifyingly crude. Imagine a bamboo tube, just bamboo at first, filled with gunpowder. Someone would pour it in, pack it down tight, place a projectile on top, often just a rock or a chunk of iron, and then use a lit stick to touch a small hole in the side. What happened next was chaos. The gunpowder would explode, the projectile would shoot out the end, and often the tube would shatter, sending shards of bamboo or metal flying backward into the face and chest of whoever was holding it. These were weapons that could kill you just as easily as they could kill your enemy. But the Chinese soldiers who used them understood something crucial that warriors before them did not. The weapon itself didn't matter as much as what it represented. It represented the future. It represented a force of nature, literally, a controlled explosion that could be unleashed on your enemies from a distance they couldn't even comprehend. The technology evolved slowly. Bamboo tubes were replaced with bronze, then with iron. The designs improved. By the 1200s, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol rulers of China, had something that looked almost like a modern weapon, a metal tube reinforced with bands of iron mounted on a wooden frame. Still primitive, still dangerous to the operator, but increasingly effective. And then, in 1287, a man named Li Ting had an idea. Li Ting, the name that changed everything. Here's what we know about Li Ting: almost nothing. He was a Jurchen commander. The Jurchen were a people who lived in what is now Manchuria, and they had been incorporated into the Yuan dynasty's military structure. Beyond that, the historical record is maddeningly vague. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know his family's name or his birthplace. We don't know if he had a wife or children. We don't even know how old he was. What we do know is that Li Ting understood the power of the cannon better than almost anyone else alive at that time. Prince Nayan, a Mongol prince, a relative of Kublai Khan himself, had rebelled against the emperor's rule. This wasn't just some minor uprising. This was a prince with significant military resources, significant support, and significant legitimacy. He genuinely believed he could win. And for a moment, it seemed possible. His forces moved through the countryside, gathering soldiers, growing stronger. The empire sent its armies to stop him. And that's where Li Ting and his cannons came into the story. The siege that changed history. When Li Ting approached Prince Nayan's fortress, he brought with him cannons, multiple cannons. The exact number is lost to history, but historical records suggest it was enough to be intimidating. The soldiers defending the fortress looked out from their walls and saw something they had never seen before, something that didn't fit into their understanding of war. Li Ting's cannons weren't particularly impressive by modern standards. They were small, crude, temperamental. But to the soldiers inside that fortress, they might as well have been devices from another world. They were unpredictable. They made sounds that no weapon had ever made before. A roar, a crack, a boom that echoed across the landscape. They fired projectiles that didn't arc like arrows. They seemed to defy physics itself. The first cannon shot was fired at the fortress walls. Imagine that moment. Imagine being inside the fortress, waiting for a traditional siege to begin, waiting for ladders and battering rams, waiting for something you understood, and then a sound like the sky was tearing apart, a smell of sulphur and smoke, the explosion of metal meeting stone, a part of the fortress wall suddenly gone, rubble where there had been solid defence just moments before. The soldiers inside must have felt something ancient awaken in their chests. Pure, primal terror. The thunder speaks. What happened next, according to the historical records we have, was devastating. The cannon fire caused great damage. It created such confusion that the enemy soldiers attacked and killed each other. Chaos, pandemonium, the kind of breakdown in military discipline that happens when soldiers lose faith in their leader's ability to protect them. But here's the thing that makes this moment so significant. It wasn't really about the cannons themselves. The cannons were crude. They probably didn't kill that many people directly. What they did was something more profound. They broke the psychological barrier that had existed since the beginning of warfare. For the first time in human history, soldiers understood that their bravery, their skill with traditional weapons, their experience and courage, none of it would matter against a force they couldn't fight back against. You couldn't challenge a cannon to single combat. You couldn't dodge it if you saw it coming. It didn't care about your honor or your martial prowess. It just destroyed. The fortress fell. Prince Nayan's rebellion was crushed, and history pivoted on its axis. The ripple effect, how one shot changed the world. What's fascinating is that most of the world didn't immediately understand what had just happened. It would take decades, sometimes centuries, for the significance of that moment to sink in. In Europe, rulers continued playing medieval games. Knights in armour charged at each other. Castles with high walls were built with the assumption that they were impregnable. And then, gradually, they started hearing stories coming from the east. Stories about weapons that could bring down walls, weapons that made armour useless, weapons that gave a technological advantage to anyone who possessed them. The medieval world was already starting to crack. Gunpowder weapons were spreading from China to Central Asia, to the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe. But that cannon shot in 1287, that was the beginning. That was the moment when someone demonstrated for the first time that you could project destructive force across a distance without being physically present. You could destroy your enemy while remaining relatively safe. Within 100 years, every major military power in Europe was obsessed with acquiring cannons. Within 200 years, the entire concept of medieval warfare, the knight, the castle, the siege, was becoming obsolete. The Renaissance military engineer replaced the medieval knight as the most valuable military mind. Fortification design had to be completely rethought, because tall walls suddenly became liabilities instead of assets. Li Ting's legacy. Here's the deepest irony of this story. Li Ting's name is barely remembered. Walk into any museum, any history class, any conversation about the great military minds of human history, and you won't hear his name. You'll hear about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Sun Tzu. You'll hear about Hannibal and Caesar and countless others. But the man who essentially fired the shot heard round the world, whose action would reshape the political map of human civilization, that man is forgotten. The cannons he used still exist, or at least some of them do, bronze tubes, reinforced with iron, sitting in museums in China. People walk past them without understanding what they're looking at. They see them as curiosities, odd-looking relics from ancient times. They don't understand that they're looking at the weapon that killed an entire way of life, because that's really what happened. The cannon didn't just defeat Prince Nayan's rebellion, it defeated the entire feudal system that dominated warfare for 1,000 years. It defeated the idea that warfare was a game with rules, played between aristocrats with swords and honour. It made warfare about technology, about manufacturing, about the ability to produce more gunpowder and more metal tubes than your enemy. This is why we can say, without exaggeration, that Li Ting fired the most consequential shot in human history. The real first shot. But wait, there's another layer to this story that makes it even more compelling. Because the question of who fired the first cannon shot is actually more complicated than you might think. Li Ting's cannons in 1287 weren't actually the first cannons ever used. The Wuwei bronze cannon, discovered in China and dated to around 1227, might be older. There are accounts, vague, uncertain accounts of cannons being used even earlier. The history of cannon is murky because these weapons evolved gradually. Fire lances could be considered proto-cannons. The madfar, an Arabian weapon, had elements of cannon-like design. At what point does something stop being a fire lance and become a cannon? This ambiguity is actually the most honest way to think about technological change. Revolutions don't happen with a single bang. They happen gradually. Someone invents something. Someone else modifies it. Someone else finds a use for it. Someone else improves it. And then, eventually, there's a moment, a real moment, when the technology shifts from being a curiosity to being transformative. Li Ting's cannon shot in 1287 represents that moment. It's the first documented use of cannons in a military engagement where they actually mattered, where the outcome would have been different without them, where the technology crossed from novelty to necessity. What could have been different? Think about how different history could have been if cannons had never been invented, if Chinese alchemists had mixed their powders differently, if somehow gunpowder had remained just for fireworks. Medieval feudalism might have continued indefinitely. Knights in armour would still be the elite military unit. Castles would still be impregnable fortresses. Wars would still be decided by massed formations of cavalry crashing against each other. Social structure would be based on an aristocracy of warriors' men skilled enough with sword and horse to dominate those beneath them. The Renaissance might never have happened, or might have looked completely different. The age of exploration might never have occurred, because ships armed with cannons were what allowed European powers to project force globally. The age of empires, with its particular character and structure, emerged directly from the cannon's invention. Democratic government, for all its flaws, partially emerged because cannons made feudal castles obsolete, which weakened the feudal aristocracy. Armies became organized at the national level by monarchs, not by local nobles in their castles. This centralization of power eventually led to the kind of nation-state that modern democracy emerged from. One man firing one cannon in 1287 is a casual point of view for massive historical forces that shape the modern world, the moral of the thunder. What's the real lesson here? It's not just that technology changes warfare. It's that innovation often comes from someone seeing a possibility that others miss. Li Ting didn't invent the cannon. He just understood its potential in a way that other commanders didn't. He was willing to use an unfamiliar, temperamental, frightening weapon because he understood that having it gave him an advantage. Throughout history, the people who changed things most dramatically were rarely the people who invented the fundamental technology. They were the people who understood how to use it in a new way. They were people willing to take risks on unproven methods. They were visionaries who could see beyond the current moment into a future shaped by their choices, and they often paid a price for it. We don't know what happened to Li Ting after his triumph. History doesn't record his fate. Did he prosper? Did he rise in status? Or did he fade into obscurity? We may never know. But his moment, that instant when he gave the order to fire, when the cannon roared, when everything changed, that moment was recorded. That moment echoed across centuries. The thunder still echoes. When you think about your own life and your own potential, remember Li Ting. Remember that one person firing one new weapon at one fortress on one night in 1287 eventually changed the entire course of human history, not through conquering empires or famous victories that are celebrated in 1,000 histories, but through understanding the moment he was living in and having the courage to act on that understanding. The cannon was only the beginning. After that night, weapons would only get more powerful, more precise, more destructive. The arc of military technology and human history itself bends toward greater and greater technological capability. That trend that started with Li Ting's cannons has led us to missiles that can strike targets thousands of miles away, to drones that can rain death from the sky, to weapons that could end civilization itself. But before all that, there was just a man with a strange new weapon standing outside a fortress on a dark night in northern China. He didn't know he was changing the world. He probably didn't even know he was making history. He was just a soldier doing his job, using the best tools available to him. And in doing so, he fired the shot that ended the medieval world and began the modern era. That thunder, echoing across 700 years, is still the sound we hear whenever we think about how the future arrives. Not with warning or fanfare, but quietly, in the hands of someone willing to try something new.